Wilsonian Progressivism in Peace and War. Chapter Introduction. American extra peace is not free. The man with only little capital is finding it harder and harder again in the field. More and more impossible to compete with the big fellow. Why? Because the law of this country do not prevent the strong from crushing the weak. Woodrow Wilson's two tumultuous presidential terms saw the apex of progressive achievements, as well as entanglement in a global war that helped snuff out the reform fires at home. The outcome was ironic because America entered the conflict buoyed by the same crusading idealism and confidence that had driven their domestic progressivism. Uh, so far, what this chapter introduction is saying is that, of course, Woodrow Wilson is tackling some of the issues of the progressive movement. However, what he also has to deal with is the conflict of a world war. Thomas Woodrow Wilson, the second Democratic president since 1861, looked like the aesthetic intellectual he was, with his clean-cut features, pinch-nose eyeglasses, and trim figure. Born in Virginia shortly before the Civil War, and reared in Georgia and the Carolinas, the professor, politician, was the first man from one of the seceded Southern states to reach the White House since Zachary Taylor, 64 years earlier. Wilson's administration for the Confederacy's attempt to win independence partly inspired the ideal of self-determination for people in other countries. Steeped in the traditions of Jeffersonian democracy, he shared Jefferson's faith in the masses if they were properly informed. The point of this paragraph is to show that Woodrow Wilson is someone that is very educated. However, his Southern background is also going to influence some of his upbringing. Son of a Presbyterian minister, Wilson was reared in an atmosphere of fervent piety, and he definitely used the presidential pulpit to preach his inspirational political sermons. The president is at liberty, both in law and in conscience, he declared, to be as a man as big as he can. Convinced that Congress could not function properly unless the president got out in front and provided leadership, Wilson repeatedly relied on eloquence to appeal over the heads of legislators to the sovereign people. So what this is saying is Woodrow Wilson, although he was very religious, he tried to kind of use that piety and also that morality to influence that it would influence his presidency. Splendid though Wilson's intellectual equipment was, he suffered from serious defects of personality. Incapable of acting like the showman like Teddy Roosevelt, he lacked a common touch and knew it. Roosevelt appeals to the voters' imagination. I do not, Wilson reflected. He is a real vivid person, whom they've seen and shouted themselves hoarse over and voted for. Millions strong. I'm a vague, conjectural personality, more made of opinions and academic propositions than of human traits and red corpuscles. So what this is saying is you're looking at Roosevelt, of course, that's more charismatic, while Wilson is kind of saying that he's someone that tends to be a little bit more hoarse. He doesn't necessarily have a strong personality. You know, he considers himself as being a real vivid person, right? So he definitely went ahead and answered the idealist in politics. How did Wilson's background affect his presidency? Of course, you want to mention something along the terms of his religious background as well as a very high educated background. He was a professor, of course, coming from the South as well. Wilson tackles a tariff. Few presidents have arrived at the White House with a clearer program than Wilson's, or one destined to be so fully achieved. The new president called for an all out assault on what called the triple wall privilege, the tariff, the banks, and the trust. Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, cover of Life, 1912. Before his election to the presidency of the United States in 1912, Wilson served as president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey. In all three offices, he earned a reputation as a moral idealist and reformer. In his Life magazine cover, he's depicted as a stern Roman consul. Wilson's academic background is represented by the scholarly owl at this side. He tackled the tariff first, summoning Congress into the special session in early 1913. In the president's shattering move, he did not send his presidential message over to the Capitol to be read loudly by a bored clerk. as had been the custom since Jefferson's day. Instead, he appeared in person before a joint session of Congress and presented his appeal with a stunning clarity and force. The House swiftly passed the Underwood Tariff, which provided for a substantial reduction of rates. When a swarm of lobbyists descended on the Senate, seeking to disembowel the bill, Wilson promptly issued a combative message to the people, urging them to hold their elected representatives in line. The tactic worked. The force of public opinion aroused by the president's oratory, secured in late 1913, finally approved of the bill Wilson wanted. The new Underwood tariff substantially reduced import fees. It was also a landmark tax in legislation. Under authority granted by recently ratified 16th Amendment, Congress enacted a graduated income tax, beginning with the modest levy on incomes over $3,000 and considerably higher than the average worker's annual income of $740. By 1917, from income tax shot up receipts from the tariff. This gap has since been vastly widened. So what you need to know, of course, is the Underwood Tariff. By definition, the Underwood Tariff was a tax that enacted an unprecedented graduated federal income tax. So what this means is that that if you are someone of lower income, that the government will take more taxes out of those that have a higher income, right? And that's what it's saying here is that incomes over 3,000, right? Of course, had a higher tax than someone that was making $740. The purpose of this was, of course, to limit wealth inequality. Wilson battles the bankers. A second bastion of the triple wall privilege was an antiquated and inadequate banking and currency system. Long since outgrown by the Republic's lusty economic expansion, the country's financial structure, still creaking along under the Civil War National Banking Act, revealed glaring defects. Its most shortcoming, as exposed by the Panic of 1907, was the inelasticity of the currency. Banking reserves were heavily concentrated in New York and a handful of other large cities and could not be mobilized in times of financial stress into areas that were badly pinched. A House committee chaired by Congressman Arsenio Pujo influenced reformers by tracing the tentacles of the money monster into the hidden vaults of American banking business. President Wilson's confidant, progressive-minded Massachusetts attorney Louis D. Brandeis, further fanned the flames of reform into his incendiary through scholarly book, Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It. In June 1913, in a second dramatic personal appearance before both houses of Congress, the president delivered a stirring plea for sweeping reform of the banking system. He ringly endorsed Democratic proposals for a decentralized bank in government hands as opposed to the Republican demands for a huge private bank with 15 branches. Again, appealing to the sovereign of the people, Wilson scored another triumph. In 1913, he signed the epical Federal Reserve Act, the most important piece of economic legislation between the Civil War and the New Deal. So what you want to understand is that prior to this paragraph right here is the author of our text kind of puts in context the corruption that exists within the federal bank. So of course, what ends up happening is he passes the Federal Reserve Act. That's Woodrow Wilson. The new Federal Reserve Board, appointed by the president, oversaw a nationwide system of 12 regional reserve districts, each with its own central bank. Although these regional banks were owned by member financial institutions, the final authority of the Federal Reserve Board guaranteed a substantial measure of public control. The board was also empowered to issue paper money, Federal Reserve notes, banked by commercial paper, such as promissory notes of business people. Thus, the amount of money in circulation could be swiftly increased as needed for legitimate requirements of business. So what you want to understand is what the Federal Reserve Act would do is it would create 12 regional banks. So regional meaning by geographic area. And it also allowed the federal government to have a board that was going to regulate those banks and create stability on a national scale. So for example, if the economy were to go through depression, or a recession, they do have the power to print more money. Reading the death warrant. This cartoon appeared in New York's newspaper soon after Woodrow Wilson called for dramatic reform of the banking system before both houses of Congress. With the money trust of bankers and the businessmen cowed, Wilson was able to win popular congressional support for the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So if you take a look at this, we definitely have answered these four questions right here. What was a triple wall? What was a triple wall of privilege? What that's asking is, what does it mean? What are the three barriers of privilege that exist that is making the rich wealthier, significantly more wealthy than the poor? And of course, that would be the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. Those are things that that Wilson is trying to regulate. Um, what were the provisions of the Underwood tariff? The Underwood tariff, remember what this is going to do, it's going to set up, right, substantial reduction of rates. When it's more specifically here, it would enact a graduated federal income tax. And of course, the Underwood tariff um, would be followed up by the 16th Amendment, right, which means that it would make it legal for the government to do this, right, to put this graduated income tax in. And then the last part we just talked about was the Federal Reserve Act. So you should be able to answer that. The provisions of it, what did it do? And there are three things that you want to make sure you understand it does. The president tames the trust. Without pausing for breath, Wilson pushed toward the last remaining rampart in the Triple War of privilege, the trust. His third personal appearance before Congress led to the passage of the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. This new law empowered a presidential appointed commission to turn a searchlight on industries engaged in interstate commerce, such as the meat packers. The commissioners were expected to crush monopolies at the source by rooting out unfair trade practices, including unlawful competition, false advertising, mislabeling, adulteration, and bribery. The knot of the monopoly was further cut by the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. It strengthened or lengthened the Sherman Act's list of business practices that were deemed objectionable, including price discrimination and interlocking directorates, whereby the same individuals served as directors of supposedly competing firms, and an end on achieved through holding companies. So, a couple things that you want to know about Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Trade Commission Act. Of course, what this does is it goes ahead and creates a board, right, a commission to go ahead and investigate some of the things that are causing a lot of corruption in businesses, such as false advertising, mislabeling, adulteration, and bribery, right, unfair practices. That's the purpose of this commission. And then what he also does is he passes the Clayton Antitrust Act, which goes beyond the Sherman Antitrust Act. One of the things that this does is, of course, it goes ahead against interlocking directorates where you're getting several people serving as directors of supposedly competing firms. So, in other words, it's a monopoly. Hypothetically speaking, let's say, for example, if someone in business A also serves on a board of business B, they're going to go ahead and do what's best for them individually to ensure that they're making more profit. We also have holding companies. These are holding companies. What ends up happening here is they're companies that own part of all or other companies in order to extend monopoly control. Often, a holding company does not produce goods or services of its own, but only exists to control the other companies. So you want to think about it as almost a company. The purpose of it is just to exist because it holds so much stock in other companies. Where then what it could do is it actually controls. It's able to control the decisions made in the other companies, thus really being a monopoly, right? So that's what you want to think about. That is a holding company is a company that holds numerous stocks in other companies. It doesn't actually produce anything, but what it's able to do is, of course, influence the production, the prices, and decisions that are being made. The Clayton Act also conferred long overdue benefits on labor. Conservative courts had unexpectedly been ruling that trade unions, such as striking hat makers in Danbury, Connecticut, fell under the anti-monopoly restraints of the Sherman Act. The new law exempted labor and agricultural organizations from antitrust prosecution. While explicitly legalizing strikes and peaceful picketing, union leader Samuel Gompers hailed the act as the Magna Carta of labor because it legally lifted human labor out of the category of a commodity or article of commerce. But the rejoicing was premature as conservative judges in later years continued to clip the wings of the union movement. So, in general, the Clayton Act, one of the things it does provide more rights to unions. Remember, with the Sherman Trust Act, uh, it was often used to break unions. So, this is a little bit of a benefit that happens here um, for unions during the Wilson presidency. Wilson at the peak. Having treated the nation to a dazzling demonstration of vigorous presidential leadership, Wilson pressed ahead with further reforms. The Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916 made credit available to farmers at low rates of interest, as long as demanded by the populace. The Warehouse Act of 1913 authorized loans of security of staple crops, another populist idea. Other laws benefited rural America by providing for highway construction and establishment of agricultural extension for work in the state colleges. So, one thing you want to understand is, of course, Wilson's policies are also benefiting the farmers, really making the Populist Party happy. Sweaty laborers also made gains as the progressive wave foamed forward. Sailors, treated brutally from Cat O' Tails onward, were given relief by the Follett Seamen's Act of 1915, requiring decent treatment and a living wage of American merchant ships. Wilson further helped the workers with the Working Man's Compensation Act of 1916, granting assistance of federal civil service employees during periods of disability, as well as enacting restricting on child labor on products flowing into interstate commerce. The stand pat Supreme Court soon invalidated the latter law, however. The Adamson Act of 1916 established an 8-hour workday for 1.7 million employees on trains in interstate commerce, with extra pay for overtime. So these are all examples of policies that that Wilson has done to benefit, just to benefit, of course, progressive area. You're getting the Follett Seamen's Act, that's better working conditions for the Navy, as well as for merchants. You're also getting on merchant ships. You're also getting the Workers' Compensation Act, right, for federal employees, that is. Then you're also getting the Adamson Act that's putting into the 8-hour workday and overtime. These are all things that workers uh, that they feel is beneficial. Wilson earned the enmity of business people and bigots, but endeared himself to progressives when in 1916 he nominated for the Supreme Court the prominent reformer Louis D. Brandeis, the first Jew to be called to the high bench. Yet Wilson's progressivism had its limits. It clearly stopped short for better treatment of blacks. The Southern-bred Wilson presided over an accelerated segregation in federal bureaucracy. When a delegation of black leaders personally protested to him, the schoolmaster's president virtually froze them out of his office. So when you're looking at Woodrow Wilson, of course, he stopped short of reform for African Americans. We definitely did answer all of these right here. What were holding companies? Of course, companies that did not produce anything. Rather, there were companies that just held stock in a lot of other companies. And the goal is to act like a monopoly. What were the provisions of the Clayton Antitrust Act? We did go through that. We expanded on how it went beyond the Sherman Antitrust Act. Of course, the Federal Commission Act of 1914 has created a board to investigate the corruption that existed within business. We did go through these: the Farm Loan Act, the Warehouse Act, Lafayette Seamen's Act. This, of course, benefited sea merchants for better worker conditions. Workers' Compensation Act for federal workers. What this is doing is it's providing some economic resources for those that were filing for disability. And then you're also getting the Adamson Act, which you need to know. With the Adamson Act, as stated, um, here it is, an 8-hour workday for trained employees. Okay. Oops, sorry.